until this prophecy's fulfilled. And since they think I got truth, they gonna be watching
Good
me
evening
for
and
real.
welcome
Watch
to the
me.
Final
But
Call
I'm just
News
still
Hour. I'm
reveal
your
this until
host,
the dawn. I
Herman
can't quit.
Muhammad.
I'm like
Now, before we get started with this evening's program, I want to tell you a little bit about the Final Call newspaper, or the Final Call News Hour, excuse me. The Final Call News Hour is the partner of the Final Call newspaper and the Final Call online edition that you can visit at www.finalcall.com. The Final Call newspaper is the most widely circulated black-owned and operated publication, not only in this country, but in the world. It also serves as the communications organ of the Nation of Islam. The Final Call News Hour is produced by the Ministry of Information under the direction of Brother Corey 2X. The Ministry of Information was born from the Millions More movement, which was launched in October of 2005 in order to ensure a future for all of our people. The overall mission of the Final Call News Hour is to bring an alternative source of news and commentary to our viewers. This is needed because although it is said that we live in a free society with freedom of press, all of America's major media, both print and electronic, are owned by 5 major corporations, which amounts to a monopoly on information. So the Final Call News Hour is a vitally important program. Now, this evening's issue, we're going to come out of volume 27, number 11, which reads, Bush Still Beats War Drums. And this is in reference to an article written by our Washington correspondent, which deals with the U.S.'s policy towards Iran and their getting rid of, so to speak, their nuclear program. Now, this evening, we have a very special edition of the Final Call News Hour because for the first time, we have the person who's really the mind, the founder of the Final Call News Hour, Brother Corey 2X. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you, Brother Herman. Pleasure to be here, my brother.
Yes, sir. It's a beautiful thing to have Brother Corey, who's usually behind the camera, actually being a guest. He's a very well-spoken, educated young man, and we're looking forward to hearing everything he has to say. Yes, now, before we get started, brother, with the content of what's in the paper, just for our viewers, why don't you tell them what was the inspiration behind you coming up with the whole concept of the Final Call News Hour?
Certainly, brother. Well, Brother Herman, you know, I felt a very strong need and recognized, rather, a need for black people to have a voice. We don't own a lot of ownership of media, whether it be newspapers, whether it be television stations, whether it be radio. And so this is a niche that I found that is so vitally necessary for us to be involved in so that we can write the stories and portray the pictures of black people as they ought to be told, instead of course, allowing someone else to portray black people in any fashion that they deem.
Right.
So I thought it was so very important that we establish the Final Call News Hour, rather, to get news out to our people, brother.
Yes,
that
sir.
was the main reason, and that was the main motivating factor, because I recognize, as you do and many of our people, that the media is controlled by just a few.
Right.
And it doesn't depict us very well.
Right. Now, how can others, if they're inspired by what you've been able to do with this particular program, how could they maybe do the same thing or something similar if they, so desired?
Well, there's a lot of ways, particularly here in Denver. One way is to utilize the public access station here at Denver Open Media, and to wherever they're at in the world, whether it be in Denver or Los Angeles or Chicago or wherever you're at in the world, most metropolitan areas and metropolitan cities have public access stations.
Right.
And so I would encourage everyone to utilize, those public access stations and utilize those to have a voice, to be heard. So I suggest anyone here in Denver, Colorado, to come on down to Denver Open Media and get some information out, get some programs out.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Now we're going to jump right into it. The first story that we're going to deal with appears on page 3 of this current issue of the Final Call newspaper. And the article reads, Bush hell-bent on war with Iran. Intelligence report finding of no nukes doesn't dissuade U.S. president's crusade. And I like that language. And this is written by our Final Call staff writer, Brother Saeed Shabazz, who's an excellent writer and who does many features in the Final Call newspaper. Sir. Now, I just want to read a little bit of the first paragraph, and then I'll ask the question. It says, the United States intelligence report that concluded Iran halted its nuclear weapons program in 2003 and is unlikely to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a bomb until at least 2010, has seemingly not changed the position of leaders in the West, certainly not the mind of President Bush. Now, despite the fact that, of course, they don't have a nuclear program that apparently, according to the UN, that is geared towards weaponry. Why do you think that President Bush finds it necessary to keep the pressure on Iran despite that fact?
Well, that's a pretty multifaceted question, Brother Herman. You know, there's a lot of levels to that question. The article in the headline says that Bush is hell-bent on war with Iran. And the cover page stated, of course, that although this intelligence report and these 16 intelligence agencies have compiled this intelligence report, he's still going against the grain, of course, of what these intelligence agencies have come up with. And it says that he's on his personal crusade. And that word crusade was, I found, to be very relevant and very indicative of President Bush's policy towards really the foreign policy in general, but particularly the Middle East foreign policy. Because it sounds much like it did in 2001 when the neoconservatives persuaded President Bush to, of course, to engage in that war with Iraq. So it sounds very similar, and it sounds like the same persuasion is still coming from, off camera, if you will.
Now, what do you know of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad? Your own knowledge of him?
I don't know much about the Iranian president. I haven't really studied or been too in-depth into Iranian policies. I do know, of course, that Iran is an independent and sovereign nation in the Middle East. And one of the things particularly about the Iranian president is that he's not one to back down to Western pressure and to Western powers. He's a man that stands for his people and stands for the sovereignty of his country. And he's not persuaded very easily by money or by anything that can dissuade his stand. So he takes a firm stand, and that's one thing that I absolutely do respect about him. And, that's really where a lot of the problem lies, in that the Western powers are beginning to realize and to understand that Iran is a major player in the Middle East, is a major power in the Middle East. And so now that Iraq and Afghanistan have been laid to waste or laid to ruin, then the major player in that region right now is Iran.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting because I know a little bit about President Ahmadinejad. But, of course, you have to go well beyond what you would get ordinarily in the media via your CNN or your Fox News, because, they paint a picture of him as being this radical Islamist who's controlled by the sheikhs and the mullahs of Iran. And that's the only reason why he's in office. When, in fact, President Ahmadinejad was a college professor before he was elected to the presidency in Iran. And he was elected largely, of course, by students or the youth. And so it really just shows that programs like the Final Call newspaper or Final Call Newshour and the Final Call newspaper are so important, because otherwise you wouldn't get that information. So we need to pay attention to Ahmadinejad because he's not a typical puppet leader, and that's why the West has such a problem with him. Now, you alluded to something a little bit earlier in your last statement, your last answer, and my question for you is, because you mentioned that Iran, of course, is a sovereign nation. Now, how can the U.S. determine what a sovereign nation like Iran does in regards to its nuclear program?
Well, really, there should be no real